Okay, I think we're up. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Miskatonic Alumni Association. I'm one of your hosts, Bill.
And I'm Terence. It's good that we've finally got together for our very first video.
Very first video. Everything is held together with duct tape and staples right now, so this isn't exactly how we wanted to do our first video, is it, Terence?
Well, I don't think you can see our studio space isn't exactly very conducive to high production values, but we're making the best of what we have.
Yeah, with the recent horrible pandemic that's sweeping through basically every single corner of the globe here. Uh, Not even going to mention what's happening where I'm living, as that's inexplicable. But yeah, Terrence, you're trapped far from home. Uh, all of our other companions are sort of scattered to the four corners, and
So, yeah.
we are not doing what we were intending to do.
Yeah, exactly. But I suppose, like they say, you've got to make the best of a bad situation. So, what better way to while away the time during this viral outbreak than discussing Lovecraft stories, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a better thing to do with our time. I mean, reading is important. It's always good to be literate and promote good creative stories. And since a lot of people are being stuck in their homes
Mm.
and not allowed to go out for good reason, uh, I think a lot of people are going to start dabbling into things that they haven't tried before, they had on the back burner until now and just didn't have time for. But things like reading books, playing games, getting into
Mm.
new hobbies and new authors, and everything that wouldn't come up in your daily life is now finally pushed to the front burner just to keep you from going mad from boredom
Yeah,
inside
very
your
much
house.
so. I mean, like, for me, one of the main points of, like, why is Lovecraft good to read at this time is not just the story content, but the fact that, like, a lot of his work is in the public domain. So even if you can't get to a library or bookstore or whatever, you're still able to just go online and get a good collection of his works out for free and pretty easily.
Yeah, you can find, I believe I got one of his complete collections on my Kindle for free. If not
Mm.
for free, I think $1. And there's even many websites around the internet that print and host the work there. If you don't mind reading it on the web page, you can instantly have access to all of his work, as well as YouTube, right?
Yeah, I mean, both of us have grabbed bundles of like Horror Babbles audiobooks, which are phenomenally
Those are
good.
really good, by the way, yeah.
Yeah, and that works very well if like you're somebody who prefers to, how can I get it, how can I say it, a more auditory input than just like having to read through large tomes of works as some of these books can be. But yeah.
Yeah, there's many ways to get your hands on it. So if you're stuck inside and if you have nothing to do and you just want to take your mind off of the troubles going on in the world, yeah, I don't think there's a better author to jump into than H.P. Lovecraft if you are interested in the horror and supernatural and weird stories. And chances are,
Mhm.
if you found this video, you are. So, I mean, yeah, I would highly recommend it, and that's why we have this channel right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose that's why in this video we're going to be looking at the stories we personally recommend for newcomers, right?
Yeah, I know a lot of people on sites like Reddit and even the different Lovecraft Facebook groups. A lot of people, when they first join up, one of the most common questions asked is, where should I start? Because there's just so many. I mean, Lovecraft was a very prolific writer.
Yeah, I think sometimes somebody who's new to sort of Lovecraft's works can get it very hung up on like, oh, there's the Cthulhu mythos, the dream cycle, and they might think they have to approach it in this specific order, whereas for me personally, I feel like it's almost more, or it's better for somebody who's new to it to come via an approachable story, because not every single Lovecraft story is very easy to just pick up and read. Some of them you've really got to dedicate some of your busy brain space to actually understanding or working your way through, because they were obviously written, you know, ages ago. So sometimes you can almost need a palate cleanser before
Yeah.
starting one of these books in order to be able to appreciate it more. So, yeah, I feel like a video like this where we can discuss these stories and why we personally recommend it could be a good starting off points for somebody who's looking to start reading.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point. Not only was it written 100 years ago or more, depending on the stories, or nearly 100 years ago, Lovecraft, even for his time, he had a very out of date, archaic way of expressing himself that likely confused as many readers back then as it does now. That's not saying it's hard to read. As you mentioned, some of them are a little overly wordy with these unusual vocabularies, but I think that there's enough, I would say, strange words, enough uncommon words that you might think when you first encounter it that this might not be for you. I mean, it's not as bad as reading like Chaucer or Shakespeare, but it's going to be yeah, you're going to come across a few rather quickly, but it's not all like that. It's just he has a very large vocabulary and not necessarily a very modern vocabulary, even for his time. And I think that adds a little bit to the charm of his stories. And that's something that I like when I read it, that you see these strange words that stand out and it starts to feel like this is a Lovecraft story because only he would speak in such terms.
Yeah, I think very much the his use of adjectives, uh, many of which, like, I mean, even as native speakers, we look and we go like, oh man, what is he actually saying here? Um, it's very much part of like what makes a Lovecraft story a Lovecraft story. It doesn't necessarily detract from the story. It's just like something somebody's got to be aware of when they get in there. That's particularly why the stories I chose are hopefully stories I found to be easy ones to use first approaching like his work. So like once you read these, you can get a sort of taste
Mm.
of how a Lovecraft story is structured and flows and what makes a Lovecraft story before like hopefully moving on to some of his other works that are maybe not as well known or
Mm.
are maybe more difficult to read, but are just as good, if not better, than some of the stories I might actually recommend today.
Yeah, and I think I took a similar approach. Some of the ones on my list, I mean, I'm only giving three. I think we're both giving three. The ones on my list, they might not be the ones I would recommend all the time to people who are already familiar with Lovecraft. They might not be the ones that jump out at me and like, oh, did you read this one?
Yeah.
But I think for a new reader coming into this very large library of works, I think the three I picked, it's a good variety of the types
Mhm.
of horror that he writes about, while again not covering everything because it's so
Yeah.
expansive. Well, shall we get into it then?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll jump us off. Scene, the first story I'm going for is probably the most quintessential or iconic one. So the first one I've gone for is obviously The Call of Cthulhu.
Ah, there we
Um,
go.
and The Call of Cthulhu, I suppose, is a story that anyone would have heard of in some shape or form, simply because Cthulhu as a character is pretty much Lovecraft and Cthulhu are almost like the same thing for many people, because Cthulhu permeates popular culture these days in so many ways. Like, you know, TV shows could reference it, video games, books, and I feel like Call of Cthulhu come from a story point of view is very well structured for me. I like that um, it's got a really good flow to it. For me, probably when I first started reading Lovecraft, that's the thing I struggled with the most, is being able to start a story and have a good flow to it. I know that's like a very iffy term, saying flow, but it makes it easier to read for me rather than having to put the book down every few pages and try to remember what is it I just read. Like I couldn't
Yeah.
remember like three sentences ago. But the plot in Call of Cthulhu is really well structured for me. It's got like a bit of the mythos in it obviously introduces or mentions like his main character quotation marks, but it makes that book for me like a really good way to first get in there, something that you're vaguely familiar with already, so it's not going to be too crazy to get into, and it's hopefully a nice little taster of what can come with other stories there.
Yeah, I agree. I think Call of Cthulhu, it's, as you say, it's pretty much synonymous with Lovecraft.
Mm.
People hear Call of Cthulhu, they think Lovecraft. People hear Lovecraft, they think Call of Cthulhu. And I mean, with the recent video game, with the role playing games, it
Yeah.
just it's just everywhere. And like you said, the structure of the story is good, and it's really it's almost cliche that this is where you should start when you're reading Lovecraft, but it's so easy because it's in, I forget, like 4 or 5 parts. And they are almost all self contained, pretty much. They're telling one aspect of the story right after the other. It's very clear, it's very to the point, and it progresses more and more until you get to the truth of the story. So I
Mm.
really like how it's structured, yeah.
Like, I mean, the irony here as well is that, like, for Lovecraft himself, he thought the story was pretty average, actually. So he wasn't actually a big fan of this, but it seemed like a lot of writers at the time, I mean, even writers today, still see this as like one of his better stories. At the same point, like another reason I went for it was simply because a lot of my first exposure to Lovecraft came via this as well. Whether it's through the RPG game, like you mentioned, or one of the video game adaptations, like usually this is the first way I think, not just myself, but most people would come. So I think it's a good way to sort of just dig a tiny bit deeper. But yeah, I think that's probably why I went for it as my number one.
Yeah, and it's not too long too. It's a great way to jump in. Good choice for number one, Terrence. I like it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to get the images of the stories on the screen too, so at least it has some context while we're talking here. So apologies if I screw up the images from time to time. Shall I move on to my number one?
Yeah, yeah.
Ready for that? Okay. My number one is going to be The Color Out of Space,
Mm,
which I chose it as my number one for two reasons.
mm,
First, my favorite Lovecraft story changes probably on the monthly basis. That as I read through again and again all the different tales of his in the different books, usually find something new that I
mm.
missed in one read through, or maybe just I'm in a different mood one day and finally I read it and suddenly it grabs me. And right now, The Color Out of Space, for the past few months, has been my number one story that I think to when I think about Lovecraft. And the second reason is on the very recent Nicolas Cage film, The Color Out of Space, which was just released simultaneously in theaters in a limited release, as well as Blu ray and digital streaming just about a
Mm.
month ago, less than a month ago. So I think um, well, for those two reasons, the title is probably going to be familiar with many people, and maybe even people who are now searching for this question, what story should I read, already have
Mm.
this in mind thanks to hearing about the movie. And secondly, if you haven't seen the movie yet, and you do read the story, I think that movie while it does have mixed reviews, really is one of the stronger adaptations of Lovecraft's work into film. And we're not going to talk about movies and films in this video here. We're just giving recommendations. We're planning on talking about films and various other media on different video down the road. But I'm just saying that now that you have both this very new telling of it, a modern adaptation of it, to go to or to come from, makes
Hmm.
this one of the easiest books to get into. The thing about that I love about this story, the thing about this story and about many of Lovecraft's stories that I really love, is the majority of them are told. It's not like you're reading the story happening. They're told secondhand or third
Okay.
hand tale from somebody else. Even in Call of Cthulhu, you get this. You don't see a lot of the action happening. You hear the action being related months, years down the road from someone's memory of what happened. And I think Color Out of Space is one of the most powerful uses of this, because it's a very tragic story. It's a very sad story, but it's also a deeply personal story. And it has all the hallmarks of Lovecraft's own brand of cosmic horror and weird tales. And again, I like you, Terrence, I don't want to go into the plot. I don't want to spoil anything. I don't even want to really give a summary of it. But
Mm-hmm.
I think compared to a lot of his stories, and even coming straight from Call of Cthulhu, this is a very small scale story that's happening in one fixed location to one very, very small particular group of people. And you are just hearing the fallout of what happened from this incident. And it's just really, it raises the hair on my arms thinking about it. Like, if this was true, could something like this really happen? What really happened? And I think it affects you because it's on a smaller scale and a more personal level than many of his other stories. And it's, I don't know if it's the right thing to say, but it might be one of the more disastrous and tragic depictions of people caught up in this mythos that Lovecraft has created. So that's
Yeah,
why I recommend it.
I think like probably the point like I can appreciate the most is where you say it happens on a smaller scale. Because sometimes I find those stories more approachable for myself, uh, which actually leads into my story I'll be mentioning now as well as my number two. Um, Usually stories on this more personal level, especially like Cut Out of Space, I think, are like really easy ones to be able to digest and read through and sort of get some connection to, whether it's an emotional or intellectual one, to appreciate it. And I think like especially now that Cut Out of Space has got a movie adaptation, it can be quite useful for somebody who's um, coming from the movie
Yeah.
and gets a semblance of the imagery behind a lot of the story to come to the book then and then use that as a jumping off point to carry on reading. Yeah, but I can definitely appreciate that as a choice.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to get into the movie at all because we're going to talk about movies and other visual adaptations of Lovecraft later. So you'll notice when you watch any movie or any adaptation of Lovecraft, there's going to be a very clear disconnect from what you read in the books too, simply because that's just how Lovecraft fiction is. It's not something that's easily depicted on screen, so you have to be forgiving what you see on screen compared to what you'll find in the book.
Yeah, because I think very much like a lot of his work is based on the sort of imagination and imagery, which, depending on, let's say, the director of a movie or something, could be down to their sort of personal reading of it as well. So, what you might sort of imagine as one of these giant elder gods or creatures or whatever could actually be very different from what you might see in a movie. which is why I suppose always it's nice to come from the books to see a movie. But I think if you're a newcomer, usually, especially with Color Out of Space, if you've been fortunate enough to catch that when it was out in theaters or if you're grabbing it wherever, like then at least you've got that as a base to work from, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. They do, in at least in this case, they work hand in hand together.
Okay, well that's good. Well, I mean, like I was saying then, it actually plays in my second pick, which
Okay.
was the Dunwich Horror.
Mm.
Um, and that's a story that I actually really only read for the first time and appreciated like a couple of years back. It was in like some small collection I'd picked up, a little cheap paperback, and I read that one. And as soon as I finished it, I wanted to read it again.
Mm.
Uh, the When you mention about it being on a small scale, like Dunwich Horror is, how can I say, a very personal story.
Hmm.
Not for myself, but I mean in terms of its plot dealing with this family stuff. Like once again, I'm not going to give a summary or anything. I feel like trying to summarize a Lovecraft story is difficult in two aspects: trying to comprehend what you're reading, plus you don't want to spoil it for anyone as well with twists and plot. But Dunwich Horror for me was a story that the ending, especially, and the build up to that ending is really well done. I mean, once you reach that a certain point in the story and it just clicks like that, and you can see how it's been building up, and you want to reread it again,
Yeah.
which I think is the mark of any good story.
Oh yeah.
And so, very much for me, like Dunwich Horror is like my perfect Lovecraft story. Like this and the next one I'm going to choose are probably my top two stories I've actually read of Lovecraft. It's always liable to change because
Yeah.
I'm like that. I might change my taste later on, but currently, like Dunwich Horror is like one of the stories I really, really, really highly recommend to anybody who wants to get a idea of what makes Lovecraft so great to read.
Mm.
And the fact is, it's not too crazy in some of the background mythos as such compared to some other stories, but it is still crazy,
Yeah.
if I can put it like that way.
I
Um,
think it's a subdued sort of crazy where it's
mm, mm,
not over the top, it's not in your face, but it's there. That supernatural horror is there.
like I think probably the thing that I appreciate most about it is there's this sort of bubbling sense of dread or something's wrong. All throughout the story you're seeing stuff that's off or stuff that shouldn't be there or something like that, and that keeps building on through the story until, like I said, it clicks into place, and then you can sort of see, oh, that's what it was. And that for me makes it like really fantastic, and it's something I appreciate not just in this story but in most of his works actually.
Yeah, I said before with getting the hairs standing up on my arms doing that. I think the ending of Dunwich Horror is a great example of that. Like you
Mm,
mentioned, when once you realize what it all meant and it clicks at the end in that moment when they reveal basically the whole
mm,
idea behind it all, that's when the chills come across and like, that's not what I was expecting, but yeah, I see
mhm.
where that was coming from now. Yeah,
Yeah,
really,
so
really quality stuff there.
that's very much the reason I went for it then. So Bull, yourself, what was your number two then?
My number two, which I believe I flashed on the screen a moment too early, anyhow, so keen-eyed viewers already knew it was coming up. My number two, this is the one I mentioned before. This is probably not a story I would hype otherwise. I like the
Mm,
story, but it's not one. It's not in my top three. Definitely for my own self. Maybe not even in my top five, even though I like it. But it's Dreams in the Witch House.
okay.
Now, again, coming from Color Out of Space, where that is, I think, more of a cosmic horror story there. It is that whole, there is this universe outside there that is unforgiving, uncaring, and humanity stands no chance against it. Our only recourse is to hope we are never noticed by what exists out there. And
Mm.
it's on the personal level. This is even on a more personal level, a smaller scale, where it's basically just one character, the dreams this one character is facing, and of course his friend also, who is in the story, hearing about this. So I mean, this is about as personal a level as it can get. But where
Mm.
it differs is, I think instead of being more on the cosmic aspect of horror, this story is just straight up horror,
Mhm.
where it still fits perfectly into the mythos, the Cthulhu mythos that he has, with the just the unknown and the supernatural, and just the way the world isn't what we think it is, but it's all focused on one poor individual and the things that this man experiences and he sees, and the reaction to him and what's happening in the world around him at the same time is heartbreaking and just
Mm.
terrifying. And the more you read about what he's experiencing, it's haunting, I think,
Mm.
is the best word. And I mean, I think we've all in our life, maybe especially those of us who are interested in weird fiction, we've all kind of daydreamed or fantasized or wondered about things, that there's secret knowledge out there in the world. There's things that maybe if we just understood this, we would understand the universe a bit better. But this story basically shows that understanding that stuff is maybe not the best thing that could happen to humanity, because one keen mind might pick up on something and notice something, and it unlocks a door, but it might not be the door you would ever want to unlock, and once it's open, it can't be shut. And I think that's why, I think for a new reader who maybe likes horror but maybe doesn't really know much about cosmic horror, I think it's an easy way to jump into because it's just scary.
Well, I think that's the beauty of Lovecraft's works, right? Like, where you're constantly thinking, and the characters themselves, like, oh, if I could just understand this, like, my mind will be open to this whole giant cosmic knowledge in a way. Um, and the other thing is, like, even for me, like, that's the story I haven't actually read that often. So a lot of times, like, because he's got such a huge body of work, it's really nice to not just stick to the same stuff. Like, that's the story that after this video, I'm probably going to pick up one of my collections and read through actually. But
Do it.
I think, like, yeah, like you say, like, these sort of plots where the characters themselves, like, you're almost going on the same journey as they are, right? Like, you're also trying to say, like, oh man, I just know there's something, yeah, I just need to understand this, how, and then it goes. So,
Yeah,
I mean, at the same point as well, like, not, I think, like, when you mentioned the story is just really scary, like, I feel like a lot of these other stories aren't necessarily scary, as in coming from, if you're somebody who's read like a lot of horror
mm,
writers, where it could be focused on the violence or gore or just plain horror aspects. Like, I feel like that's not Lovecraft, something Lovecraft does at all.
mm,
Um, he does it on occasion, yeah, but I just feel like Lovecraft's a whole different type of horror to himself.
definitely he is a genre.
Yeah, so I mean, I can really appreciate that. So that for me is a really good pick then.
Yeah, why don't you tell us what your number three is then?
Okay, my number three is The Whisperer in Darkness.
Yeah,
Um,
interesting
this
choice. Yeah.
is That is one that I feel is very like usually when I look at stories, I'm looking at them from more of a structure point of view.
Mhm.
So what I like about this, I don't know how I would say it, but it's very self-contained in that it takes part in in several locations. But
Mhm.
the thing is, there's this one central farm
Yeah.
where everything takes place, really, everything important as such. And the way it's structured with the main character, like I think what I like in this one is the way that you're going on this journey with him as well, and you're experiencing the story with him as he's experiencing it. Because I know some Lovecraft stories usually will be a sort of retelling or recounting the story from like, oh, this happened to me several months back, or whatever the case is. And those ones are really good, but sometimes they can be a bit of an information dump. Um,
Mm.
and I found this one is nice, as in it sort of marries together these two things of this like main character or this protagonist, like talking about what he's experiencing, but at the same point, like the actual plot is you're getting to also experience it rather than just to hear it told by him. Um, and I think, like, again, similar to the Dunwich Horror, for me, like, the ending of the story is one that leaves you wanting more. It's like as soon as that story ends, and you sort of see this last image in your head, it just makes you want to dig into the story again or to move on to something similar. Which I think, for me, my number two and three, that's particularly why I'm choosing them, because I want these to be sort of like little tasters, little appetizers that are going to get you ready to dig into the more meaty stories later
Mhm.
on. Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I mean, like I say, I was surprised that you picked this as one of your top three. Not that it's a bad story at all. I mean, it's really, really clever, but I think it's a good reason that instead of jumping into the meaty ones, you get these samples showing just how powerful these stories can be. And this is a really good one that there's a lot of simple elements strung together so well. And like you say, it's not a retelling, it's not one of those information dumps. You're more or less seeing it happen as it's happening. And that's one of, I think, the stronger elements of Whisper in Darkness.
Yeah, for sure. So hopefully, like I said, it could lead to people becoming bigger fans simply through their first exposure being this. But yeah. As for your third storyboard, what did you go for?
Well, I went meaty. You stayed away from meaty. I went meaty for my final one, simply because I just thought it had to be said. At the Mountains of Madness. I mean, it's typically consistently ranked as maybe the best Lovecraft story. Uh, I mean, right up there with Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu is probably the most well known, but I think At the Mountains of Madness is Lovecraft at his most Lovecraftiest. I
Mm.
think it has all of the elements that define his style, and it's so much more polished than you get in a lot of his stories. And again, he's written so much. So you're going to have good stories, you're going to have so-so stories, you're going to have some sloppy early stories. But I think At the Mountains of Madness really demonstrates the height of his ability as a horror writer. And not only that, it's his longest work, too. And even then, it's not that long. So, compared to any other novel you might pick up, compared to any other book you might get into, Lovecraft is really good in the fact that they are short stories. And At the Mountains of Madness, as long as it is still a
Mm.
very short read comparatively. And I think the length really does it justice, though, compared to some of his other stories. I think some of his other stories, some of them could have been longer, but I think
Mhm.
most of them are about the right length. They never get longer than they need to be because Lovecraft, He's not interested in telling subplots. He's not interested in having any kind of romantic relationships crop up. He's not interested in doing some big, epic, grand story, like you would find in blockbusters. What he's doing is he's taking a slice out of the lives of normal people
Hmm.
and showing them in their worst, and not the worst for how they are, but the worst in the worst that could possibly befall them. You're getting that slice of life and slice of disaster. There's no
Hmm.
room for subplots in that. There's no room for a spontaneous romance to break out because of that. Think about your daily life. Think about some horrific thing that happened to you sometime in your life. Cut that out of your life as a whole and make that a story. It's just going to be what it is. And
Hmm.
that's how most of Lovecraft stories are. But this is probably as close as his stories come to an epic,
Hmm.
with one notable exception that I'm not going to talk about in this video here. But you're following a grand expedition in Antarctica, and the thing is, it's slow. It's
Hmm.
very methodical how it's paced, but you are discovering the horror along with the, I wouldn't say the author, but along with the reteller of the story. You are discovering these just small little clues, these small little details, or even these big details of some things they're encountering. And your mind is trying to be scientific, just like the characters in the story, and try to put together, like, well, what does that mean? What
Hmm.
does that mean? And then as the story's going on, you have that safety net as a reader, not experiencing it, to be able to step back and see, like, oh God, that's what's happening. But of course,
Hmm.
the characters you're following in the story don't know that just yet. And then you are there as this unwitting companion being dragged along with them as you know it's going to get worse and worse, and you're seeing sometimes literally the writing on the wall of what is waiting for them, but you have no choice to follow them through until they find it on their own. And it's just so wonderfully done. It's creepy, it's magnificent,
Hmm.
it has all the elements that I like about any other Lovecraft story, just exponentially put inside his biggest tale and his most exciting. It's almost an action adventure. It could be an Indiana Jones story if Indiana Jones was into cosmic horror. But it's something else. It needs to be read. It needs to be experienced sometime. That's why it's number 3 on my list. I wouldn't say do this one first.
Hmm.
I'd say all the examples you gave, Terrence, I really think are wonderful. The first two I gave, dude, they're nice, simple stories to slip into. But I
Hmm.
think if you are going to dabble into Lovecraft, you deserve to treat yourself to At the Mountains of Madness as early as you can.
Yeah, I think definitely that's like would have been on a list if I had gone to like say number 4 or 5.
Yep.
I think the telling thing for me is as difficult as it is for people to adapt Lovecraft into movies and that At the Mountains Madness has pretty much been adapted into a movie in terms of like for me coming from John Carpenter's The
Mm.
Thing was
Right.
highly influenced by that. It's not exactly the same story, but it's pretty much got that same feeling and setting and everything. And at the same point, Guillermo del Toro's movie that he nearly got made as well.
I hope he does it someday because yeah, I have faith in him. But I guess we could save that for our Lovecraft movie video.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, so for me, like the fact that these two, like there was actual adaptation nearly made and The Thin as well, um, shows that this story is hit like a really strong point with a lot of creative people out of there. A lot of directors and a lot of writers read it and are immediately taken with it. I know for me, like my main takeaway from that was that it was a really good look at a lot of the underlying sort of mythos of the greater Lovecraft cosmic horror world in a way.
Mm.
Um, and it's also really nice, like in terms of the setting. Like at some points, like you're reading there and you're seeing them on their travels in Antarctica, and it's just like you're as blown away as they surely are when they see the things that they see. And definitely, I think I agree with you. It's like almost like for me one of his high points in terms of his story writing. Like I know we joke all the time that he loves overusing adjectives like in his descriptions, but yeah, that comes into play very well. Like it's the perfect sort of match of his style of writing and story and setting and atmosphere and characters, and it just all these things come together to form like a really cohesive plot and story that's really wonderful. Like I think, like you mentioned, like the fact that you're going along on this with them and you can see things that they might not realize just yet. That's what makes the story for me really great to read. That you just know what's going to happen at some point, and yet you can still be surprised by it as well.
Yeah, and it is surprising, and especially I think the thing I like. I don't know if I can say the best about it. I think the description
Mm,
is what I like the best about the story. But the thing I really like is that what they find in this story also isn't exactly what you think they're going to find too. Even after reading
mm,
halfway through it, you're thinking, "Oh my God, it's because of this. It's because of this." But then there's even worse things left to be discovered, and so
mm.
it keeps surprising the more you read it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really awesome choice for number three. Like, I think for myself, like, if I can sort of mention then some of the general things that I think actually are good about these choices is like I feel everything we've sort of touched on is like a nice little mix of short stories or easily digestible stories, which can be finished off with something big like At the Mountains of Madness. Like I feel like you've got a lot of choice when it comes to reading Lovecraft. You
Mm.
can either, if you're somebody who just needs these little shots of horror, you can read some of his short stories and just come away feeling like really satisfied. But at the
Mm.
same point, like if you want something like as we said, meatier or something more substantial, you can easily grab one of his thicker works and just read through that and come away just as satisfied, if not more so. So definitely for me, like this, the stuff we've chosen today, I feel like hits on all the points that make Lovecraft really good for me. You know, this sense of uncertainty and dread that's like underlying the horror. Like a lot of the horror for me from these stories comes through this like we as humanity cannot understand these things and we are incapable of understanding them, whether or not we want to understand them. So, as the saying goes, ignorance is bliss. And sometimes, in terms of Lovecraft stories, like the characters would have been better off not knowing or finding out what they have found out. Um, but I do like the way there's this larger mythos as well under these stories, right? Like, it really makes digging into the short stories worth it because it builds up this whole picture then that whether whether or not like we can actually sort of get a whole image of that or a whole view, it still really makes readings a satisfying experience then.
Yeah, and the more you read, you'll notice elements from one story, sometimes even characters from one story, creeping up
Mm,
in another, either directly appearing or just mentioned in another
mm,
story. So it helps build the sense that everything is part of the same universe. And you'll recognize things, just offhand things. The more you read it, it'll have
mhm.
more meaning the next time around. And I think that's one of the more exciting aspects of going back and rereading Lovecraft again and again.
For sure. Well, I think that's a really good selection of books we've given there. Like,
I think so,
um,
yeah.
yeah, it's definitely, the thing is like we're not just like stuck with these 6 stories in total. Like anyone who's keen to carry on reading more Lovecraft, I mean, even people who've read Lovecraft, sometimes you tend to skip over some of his stories and just focus on the ones you like. So it's always great to sort of get some recommendations, you know. I know for myself, like I definitely want to dig out my little copy of the Necronomicon and give that a read tonight again and maybe revisit some stories I haven't read in a while.
Yeah, and as we said, you can find most of these stories pretty much anywhere, even listed
Mm.
online. But I think one of our, together, Terrence, one of our personal favorites is this collection here. This is most of his stories there, so I think if you give Lovecraft a try and
Mm.
you really get into his work and you want to have as complete a copy of his work as you can, I mean, it's really hard to go wrong if you get the Barnes and Noble collection
Sure.
here, the complete fiction. We'll put a link to this down below to the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society store where you
Mm.
can buy it. And there's plenty of other, you could probably find it on Amazon and maybe Book Depository, many places. But I do want to say we are both members of the H.P. Lovecraft
Mhm.
Historical Society, both lifetime members there. Just an amazing group, and there's a lot of stuff I'm looking around the room here straight from there that's inspiring future videos that we'll be making. But I also want to give a thanks to them and a shout out. They
Mhm.
allowed us to use some of their fonts for the title cards for this premiere episode. So again, Andrew Lehman, Sean Branny, they're always super helpful guys. So while you can find this anywhere, we're going to link it to the store, the HPLHS, because really the work they do is spectacular. And if you're interested, wait until you see some of the stuff we show in upcoming videos because it's going to blow you away what those people do over there.
Awesome. I'm looking as forward to it as I'm sure many of the viewers are as well, then.
Yeah, and before we go, just one last thing. Like anyone, if you come across this video, as you can see, we're all just stuck in quarantine in our own way here, just chatting about stuff we like. So if you have anything to add, just add a comment, write something down below. It's not like we're so busy that we're not going to get back to anyone who has a comment here. So it would be nice to talk with fellow fans. That's really why we're doing this. We
Yeah,
just
exactly.
love
Like a
discussing and
nice,
yeah,
sorry, a nice sense of community. So that's probably what HPLHS for me is like the way there's a community fostered around it. So hopefully,
very much, yeah.
we can grab a tiny bit of that as well and have just as good interaction with anyone who's interested.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah. Don't be shy. Forgive us for all the jitters and hiccups here on our debut video. This is not what we were intending, but you got to start somewhere, right, Terrence?
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully soon I'll be back in my
You will.
apartment in Shanghai, so then
Yeah.
we'll be a tiny bit more professional. But I think it went off pretty well.
Yeah, it was nice hearing your stories there. I mean, this is the first time I really got to hear your opinions on these things. So
Yeah.
it's fun. You've given me motivation to go back and reread Whisper in Darkness. Maybe that'll be later tonight then.
Oh no, awesome. Well, glad I could. Same for you.
All right, I think we've run our course here, so I think it's time to stop the recording. So there's no fancy sign off here, but again, if you watched this far, if you watched
Uh-huh.
any of it, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Please just comment. Let's have a discussion going. Let's make community. We're all members of the Alumni Association, right? We all got our
Yeah.
degrees from Miskatonic, so let's enjoy it, right?
Yeah, for sure. So hopefully everyone enjoyed it and looking forward to the next one.
All right, take it easy. Thanks a lot. See you next time.
Cheers. Bye.